Next in line of the early Highpointers, the unknowns, is George Peters. George topped Guadalupe Peak in 1955 to be the third person to officially, according to Highpointer records, complete his project. However, these were the years of rapidly changing surveys, and by his own stricter standards, it was not until 1972 that he revisited the newly surveyed high points to complete the project by today's resurveyed standards. George espoused a point of view held by some high pointers that credit for a high point should be verified on the latest USGS survey, the latest USGS survey. In a letter to Stebbins in 1961, George pointed out that A.H. Marshall can only be credited with the first attempt because he died before he returned to the newly surveyed high points. This point of view has some credence, but the directors of the Highpointers Club take the view that A.H. Marshall was the first. I met George in 1967 when my wife and I took to the northeast high points. We drove up to his Honey Hollow retreat in the Catskills, a 22-acre piece of heaven. His home, built in 1786 by Quakers, was perfectly preserved, and the original owner was buried in the backyard. Sure, they did that in those days. George was an avid ornithologist. He knew his local chickadees by name as they came to eat seeds out of his hand. George possessed a unique collection of fist-sized rocks taken from each of the state summits. And this was described in the 1966 Ripley's Believe It or Not newspaper column. The naturalist Edward Wade Teal devoted an entire chapter to his exploits in his book, Journey into Summer. George later climbed Mauna Kea in 1958, claiming the first to attain the 49 states. After George comes the Reverend Floyd Floyd McDermott. Mac, as his friends called him, was born in 1899 on a Wisconsin farm, and at an early age got a calling for the ministry. While in New York State, Mac spent his spare time leading groups of boys on climbing trips in the Adirondacks. He climbed Mount Marcy a dozen times, as well as dozens of other summits in the range. One day in 1952, he suddenly realized that he'd already done 24 and might as well do all the rest. In 5 short years, Mac completed the remaining 24 states, completing the project on granite in 57, and becoming the 4th person to join the growing fraternity of early Highpointers. At one time, Mac was invited to New York City to appear on the To Tell the Truth TV program. Maybe some of you saw it. Some older ones. No, I didn't even see it.
How was it, Jack?
Yeah. I first met Mac in 1969 when he stopped off in Portland on his way to do Mauna Kea. On his way down from the summit, he found that his rented Jeep had bogged down in a snowfield near the summit. Mac started walking down, and 13 miles later met the rescue team. 26 hours later, after rescuing the Jeep, Mac returned to his anxious wife. Now we know why rental agencies don't allow their cars on Mauna Kea. On his 1969 visit to Portland, he asked me to accompany him up Mount Hood, which he had already done years earlier. He was now 70 and in fine physical shape, but pointed out that he might be a little slow. We took our time and reached the summit just an hour later than the usual time. At the summit, we were surrounded by much younger climbers who were amazed at the strength of the 70-year-old man. The Reverend was a very spiritual man, but what was so remarkable about him was his very New Age philosophy concerning the relationship between man, nature, evolution, and fitness. To Matt, these concepts were closely connected. While climbing Mount Humphreys with his daughter, the Reverend was struck by lightning. He was thrown back into his daughter, who feared that he was knocked off the mountain. In a state of shock, somehow both of them got off the mountain safely. We can only speculate why the Reverend survived, but I like to think that this brush with death led Mac to perceive God and the universe in a very different way. And that's where I came in, because this was the 60s, and his New Age ideas greatly influenced me. When we met in 1969, I saw not only a man who radiated spiritual as well as physical energy, but who possessed insights that I had never ever even thought about. He viewed evolution, for instance, as a process by which nature moves the species forward by continual testing to a point where we are in complete harmony with our environment. He believed that the physical body we now possess is the end result of this process, and that we need to keep the body fit by hard physical work like climbing in order to continue moving evolution ahead. Well, I was fascinated by these ideas. The Reverend McDermott changed my life. Mac ascended Mauna Kea in 1959, the year Hawaii joined the Union, placing him as the first to complete the 49 and the fourth to complete the lower 48. We go on to Frank Ashley. I remember Frank as a climber, promoter, and accomplisher of a notable project done with limited resources and bold determination. We know Frank best as the first completer of the 48 states in 1 year, 112 days to be exact, the author of the first high-pointing guidebook, and the inspiration behind the club's Frank Ashley Award. The award is bestowed annually to club members in recognition for significant volunteer service to the club. Frank bridged the gap between the limited knowledge some of us early Highpointers presented to the larger new generation of Highpointers by publishing the guidebook High Points of the States. This little book inspired a whole new generation of Highpointers, the ones who later went on to form the club. Before Frank embarked on his climbing project back in 1969, he needed information in the form of easy-to-follow directions to some of the harder-to-find high points. I remember writing a very long and complicated, if not, I hope not confusing, direction to Mount Arlon, which he somehow reduced to be understandable in his book. The guidebook was published in 1970, sold for $1, and was published by California's La Siesta Press. Of course, is now out of print, but is in the rare book category. Frank was proud to be the first to complete the lower 48 in less than 1 year. When I met him in Portland after the trip, he was beaming. He loved to poke fun at himself and felt very clever at getting certain freebies for his trip. Or by, being loaned a free camper by Ready Camp of Riverside, California. Or by raising funds for his trip by offering souvenirs consisting of envelopes with a commemorative stamp. Each was notarized and sent out to the investor from a post office near where each high point was reached, and they sold for $7 per set. Frank later moved to Missouri and was visited by our own John Mitchner and Dave Colville, who were en route to the 1999 Missouri Convention. Frank died shortly thereafter at the age of 69. Next in line of the early Highpointers was Ben Hoeman. After the 48 and 49 completers, what comes next? You guessed it, the Big 50. It took an expedition-level mountaineer like Ben Hoeman to be the first to score the first 50. Ben was a friend I never met, although we had several near-close encounters. I knew him only through correspondence and readings of his mountaineering adventures. He died at the age of 32 by avalanche on Delangiri in 1969. The only survivor of the slide had just left camp when it rumbled down upon Ben and the other members of the expedition. His death ended a brilliant mountaineering career, but also plans to write a high-pointing guidebook. In an ironic twist of fate, Ben's wife, Grace, was also killed in the avalanche in Alaska just 2 years later. Ben had a stellar mountaineering history. His accomplishments are well known, so I will not address them here, but he loved Denali. In 1963, Ben led the first east-to-west traverse of the Great One. He traversed the mountain from north to south in 1965, arriving on the summit just in time to view a solar eclipse. In 1967, Ben helped recover the bodies of 6 mountaineers from the ill-fated Wilcox expedition. He also climbed in the Andes and spent his honeymoon with Grace climbing in the Alps. Ben met Roland Stebbins on a hitchhiking trip across America in 1966. But I believe he never met George Peters as they had proposed, or any of the other early Highpointers. The busy lives and extensive travels precluded many of us meeting more than one at a time in those days. We basically corresponded by old-time snail mail. Ben, like Arthur Marshall, climbed at a time when new surveys were being made and may not have actually reached the new high points now known to the club. Ben may not have actually done these new high points of Michigan and Iowa, but is officially credited with being the first to attain the 50 summits. And last on my list of old-time